Now, ABC Radio National's flagship news program, Radio National Breakfast, we read today in the Australian newspaper, story by Sophie Ellsworth, that they're in some sort of crisis. Now, they had long-time host Fran Kelly. She stepped down 2 years ago, and when she went, so did about a third of the audience. A staggering 34% drop in just 24 months in ratings. Now, in the last financial year, as we know, the ABC got more than $1 billion in 2023-24. The government will hand out $1.08 billion, and in 24-25, the ABC gets a rise, $1.1 billion. A lot of money for a left-leaning broadcaster that really doesn't represent all Australians at all. Let's bring in my panel tonight. Former Victorian Liberal President and ABC board member Michael Kroger and former Labor Senator Stephen Conroy. Great to have you on board.
Steve?
Now, Michael, you were on the board of the ABC. Why did you torture yourself by doing that?
Well, because I was asked to do it, but you can fix the ABC if you have a board committed to doing it. Unfortunately, even though the Howard government appointed most of the board members, there wasn't a lot of will to fight. And unless you fight the management, you end up with the ABC as is today, which is a disaster.
Stephen Conroy, I must admit, I don't think I have listened to Radio National Breakfast at all or very often. That's more likely to be a program you'd be tuning into. Is there a problem with the current host?
Well, look, I was a huge fan of Fran, so I confess I haven't listened to it a lot since I left politics. I don't need to plug myself in quite the same way that I did previously. So I don't think I've dumped listening to it because of the change in producer. I just don't listen to quite as much political news first thing in the morning. Often I'm out cycling, trying to keep myself in some sort of shape. And so I tend to miss Radio National. So I guess that's a reflection of my priorities rather than the show. I mean, what I've been disappointed about the ABC over the last 10 years or so is it's lost its focus on its news and its quality of its news. And so I think the board over the last 10 years has allowed it to be distracted.
Can we tell our friend Mr. Conroy you can put earbuds in and fight at the same time?
This is what we've got to say about the ABC. It's no longer trusted. I mean, no Liberal voter in this country, apart from a very small group, trusts the ABC. And trust in the national broadcaster has plummeted in recent years. You can't trust them on The Voice. You can't trust them on asylum seekers. You can't trust them on anything they say about Dutton or Morrison. They didn't like Howard. They never liked a Conservative Liberal leader. They didn't like Tony Abbott because they loved Malcolm. Liberal voters, National Party voters, do not trust news and current affairs coming out of Sydney. Country ABC radio, different.
Yep.
But what's coming out of Sydney, this is not the most trusted media organisation. Far from
sad.
it.
It should be.
Well, it's sad for $1 billion. Plus, I think there's some transmission costs on top of that, by the way. It's another $100 million. But the national broadcaster likes to say we're the most trusted organisation. That is clearly bunkum these days, unfortunately, Steve.
Well, Stephen, I mean, that is a problem. I mean, you know, you and I are old enough and ugly enough to remember when the ABC, particularly ABC Melbourne, was a high-rating radio station. They've lost huge numbers from the local Melbourne ABC, and they make strange decisions. I mean, the two shows, breakfast shows in Sydney and Melbourne on local radio are hosted by comedians.
No, look, I think the incessant attacks by the Liberal Party and you know, Michael would be at front and centre and proud to be front and centre of those campaigns have actually meant that you know, they've had these editorial guidelines. You can't have an opinion, you can't express an opinion. So they try and hide behind comedians who can say, oh, we were just joking, rather than actually attempting to present and analyse news. So I think the amount of news and the shows that are being reduced, even the drum. And let me assure you, I am a massive critic of the drum. I mean, I disagree with Michael on the basis that the left wing of the Liberal Party run the ABC, along with the Greens. It's not a pro-Labor organisation. And when they announced they were cancelling the drum, I texted a friend of mine who works there and said, how will the left wing of the Liberal Party in New South Wales talk to each other if they can't go on the drum?
That's a bit rich. Now, Michael, I mentioned at the start of the program, it seems that the union movement, the
completely
AWU,
accurate.
have suddenly worked out that there's not going to be a lot of jobs out of this new green energy projects, where we import everything from the blades to the wind towers to the solar panels, and so the AWU have now gone, well, hang on, where are our jobs going to be?
Yeah, well, there's a fascinating article in The Australian this morning, if people didn't read it. Keith Pitt, the National Party MP, did a survey of the 8 biggest new projects. $24 billion for these 8 projects. 170 permanent jobs. 170. So Chris Bowen's saying there are 600,000 jobs in the renewable sector. I mean, I hope Chris is right, but he's been wrong about almost everything during his career. Let's get Chris to come on the show and give us a list of where those 600,000 jobs are coming from. This seems to be fanciful, and the AWU, a little bit slow, but they seem to be waking up to this, Steve.
Stephen Conroy, that is obviously going to be a concern for the Albanese Labor government if the unions are going to turn on them on the lack of jobs.
No, but to be fair, I think that's been an issue for a number of years. And I've heard Albanese talk about wanting to be a producer of, some of these renewable sectors, particularly some of the components in the renewable sectors. He's talked about wanting to be a battery manufacturer here in Australia. So I think the government have said the right things, but where I think you're seeing is as their policies are driving more and more projects to get onto the building phase, the criticism that, all of this is taking place offshore. I mean, I think there's one solar panel manufacturer in Australia at the moment. I mean, this is our technology. Australia developed this technology. We should be exploiting it. We are a natural place for there to be, solar.
Well, why is the government not getting on and doing it
in
then?
The world? No, well, I think it's a fair criticism of the unions to say, OK, we've got all these projects on the go, we're behind you on the renewable target, now let's start seeing some actual production in Australia. It's one of the reasons the National Reconstruction Fund's been set up. It's always hard to push
these things for 18 months. We can't even make a windmill.
Yeah, let's be clear, Steve. The world doesn't work that simply in terms of legislation passing Parliament to establish these funds. I wish it did. I myself went through, a couple of years trying to drive, and I was, solely focused on driving the rollout of the National Broadband Network, which did create and still creates jobs on a massive scale in Australia. But it actually takes, whether it's bureaucratic resistance, whether it's legislative slowdown, there's a whole variety of factors, and it takes focus and determination. And I think the government should take heed of what the unions are saying to start driving this agenda. I know Ed Husick will be on this. He's been championing these sorts of issues for years.
Michael, I note Woolworths have done a survey of their customers. 40% of their customers predict their families are going to be worse off financially next year. That's a real worry for the government, but it's more of a worry for the poor people who can't afford to buy groceries.
It's terrible. It's terrible, and I think things are going to get worse next year because people cannot afford. If you look at household savings ratio, it's plummeted. All the money they stacked away during the pandemic, gone. At the core of Albanese's problem, by the way, people haven't worked this out yet, at the core of Albanese's loss of support is the fact that before the election, he said to people, the subliminal message was, life is meant to be easy. He twisted Malcolm's word. He said, life is meant to be easy. It's Morrison and Frydenberg and those Liberals, cost of living crisis. Jim Chalmers and I will fix all of this. He led people to believe that it would be easy to fix cost of living issues, and now people have worked out they were lied to, Steve.
They were lied to. Michael Kroger and Stephen Conroy, thank you very much for your time.